Greetings, Superdetailed Baneblades, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
Today we'd like to look at a subject that we mentioned a few episodes ago, and that, like most things in Games Workshop's history, is a little more complicated than it probably should be.
You may, in your terrifying travels across the internet, have stumbled upon images of old, bulky 40k vehicles that are said to be produced by a company called Armorcast in the caveman times known as, I don't know, sometime in the 90s. But like so many things you read online, that summary might not be entirely true, and the model could in fact be from any one of a quartet of companies from the United States. This video is about those four companies.
There was a time during the early days of Warhammer 40,000 that there was a distinct lack of vehicle models. For a while there was only really two if you discount the smaller metal ones, and those two were the Rhino and the Land Raider. Hence why you got Imperial Guard Rhinos and even Harlequin Land Raiders. Everyone just had to share what limited kits there were. This would change over time, of course, but the point is that it wasn't always like today where every race has a selection of heavy armour to choose from. However, there was another game set in the 40k universe with a greater focus on vehicles, and that was Epic. Now, we don't want to get too deep into it since, well, Epic is its own heap of complications, and when you say Epic you could actually be referring to quite a few things, including the original Adeptus Titanicus. All that's important for this story, however, is that Epic was another game set in the 40k universe, was very small in scale compared to the main game, and had a heavier emphasis on the larger engines of war.
At some point around 1990, a man from California named Mike Biassi looked at one of the Epic scale Titans and, using his skills as a sculptor, decided to make one at 40k scale. He then got in contact with Games Workshop to ask if he could have a license to sell copies of his Titan along with other models based on things from Epic, and GW agreed. This might seem unlike them today, but GW of old were a very different company. This was around the time that they had that record label after all, which, by the way, we did a whole video on. So Mike set up Mike Biassi Studios and started producing a number of large vehicles for 40k, namely a Reaver Titan, a Warhound Titan, a Baneblade / Shadow Sword, an Eldar Tempest, an Eldar Knight, and an Eldar Phantom Titan, all based on their Epic equivalents.
Now, unfortunately, we can't do what we normally do in this kind of video and put any of these on a turntable for you to get a good look at, since A, our turntable is broken, and B, perhaps more importantly, we don't have any of these models. From what we can gather, most, if not all of the models we're talking about today were never supposed to be sold outside of the USA, reportedly by GW's stipulation. So although many did end up getting imported over here, they're not super common, and as you would expect, they end up a little on the pricey side.
So unless I'm able to marry some super rich old dude who dies in mysterious circumstances directly after putting me in as the sole beneficiary of his will so I inherit vast sums of money, it's probably pretty unlikely that we'll ever get to own any of these old models. But anyway, according to some bloke named Tim, we'll get to him in a moment, the Mike Biassi Studios models were sculpted in clay, then cast in resin and held together with metal bolts in the cases of the larger models, and like the other models we're looking at today, have a very distinct aesthetic. They look as if you took one of the smaller epic scale models and simply scaled them up, with all the exaggerated quirks of making a model that small kept intact, largely because that's pretty much exactly what they were. So they look particularly cartoony and low on fine detail, especially when compared to their modern equivalents, but they weren't produced with anywhere near the resources of Games Workshop proper. Mike was, after all, just one dude, so what was achieved was pretty damn impressive.
40k models need rules, however, so Mike got in contact with the creator of Inquisitor magazine, I need to look up how you pronounce this guy's name. Tim Dupertuis. Inquisitor was an unofficial Warhammer 40,000 publication that began in June of 1991. There's not a super amount of information available about it online, but it seems pretty neat from what we could find, with plenty of unofficial rules to expand your games. Mike sent Tim a letter asking for help in creating rules for his Reaver Titan, one thing led to another, and rules for Mike's Titan were printed in issue 3 of Inquisitor in January of 1992. Around this time, Tim also gained the rights to produce a Vindicator conversion kit, although this seems to be the only kit that he produced solo, so we're only mentioning it here for completeness.
Now we have a man named Nick Tompkins, who, seeing Mike's models, saw an opportunity. In his own words, where he was going big, I could go small. So around 1991 he produced some test models, sent them off to GW, and likewise got a license to produce kits which he would sell under the name of Epicast USA. Epicast would produce more vehicles based on those from Epic, but of a smaller size than the massive Biassi Titans. The complete list of 40k models, according to Nick, was an Imperial Termite, an Orc Bowel Burner, an Orc Spleen Ripper, an Orc Gob Smasher, an Eldar Falcon, a Vindicator/Whirlwind Rhino conversion kit, a Mork Stomper, a Gork Stomper, don't mix those up, you will pay the price, a Space Marine drop pod, and an Imperial bunker. The drop pod is particularly interesting since, especially unpainted, it can take a moment to figure out what's going on with it. But that's just because, as you would expect, it's based on the old epic drop pods that, unlike the modern ones, were round and would unfold, not unlike a Terry's chocolate orange. There was also an Epicast version of a Knight Paladin planned, but that was never released. The Epicast models also came with a data fax, which contained all the vehicle's stats so you could play with them, although they were on paper rather than the nice format the official ones were. All very much like how modern 40k minis usually come with their basic rules when you buy them now, actually.
Also, something curious is that Epicast made more 40k models than their official list shows. Okay, so the official list of models that we're working from comes from the now defunct Epicast website, only viewable today through the Wayback Machine. It comes from an article called The Lost and the Banned that goes into some detail about all these companies making resin models for 40k and listing what they made. However, the Epicast list only shows the models they produced that were recreations of models from Epic, and there were a few more, like this Orc drop pod or these Eldar skimmers, that were original designs by Epicast yet still came with all the official GW licensing and rules. So you can find examples of the Skimmer Hawk, a weaponless hovering transport, both as a 40k Eldar vehicle and as a generic Space Elf vehicle with no GW copyright. Both of these examples come from 1995 too, the same year as Epicast's license to produce 40k kits ran out. In fact, looking at older iterations of their website, we can see that some of these models were available for many years after they cut ties with GW, just under those generic names. I suppose that's why they're not in the official list, since Epicast just owned the rights to the designs and they weren't 40k specific. They just got to visit the grim darkness of the far future for a little while.
Around 1995, Mike Biassi's association with Games Workshop ended, according to him because he was starting to develop a sensitivity to the resin used to make the miniatures, and he was a one-man crew, so that was sort of a big deal. A new firm stepped in to take his place. A man named John Richardson and some of his friends approached Games Workshop to create copies of the Mike Biassi models, along with some new models, but this time on a larger scale of production. They, like the others, were given a license and started Forge World USA, no relation to the modern Games Workshop Forge World company. Forge World USA produced copies of the Biassi Warhound, Reaver, Baneblade, Shadow Sword, and Eldar Tempest, as well as unique 40k models for the Eldar Wave Serpent and the Tyranid Dactylus. There's also an Orc Huge Gobsmasher, Orc Speedster, an Eldar Prism Cannon, and an Eldar Doomweaver. Although we have no idea if any of these saw mass production because there's either little or contradictory information about them. For example, the Huge Gobsmasher is listed on that old Epicast article as unreleased, but we've also seen images of one with its packaging, so who knows? Like the Epicast models, they also came with their own data faxes so you could play with them right out of the box.
That would be all there really is to say about Forge World USA. They didn't really last very long, but in our research we may have uncovered some 25-year-old drama. Since most of this story occurs before what you would think of as the modern internet existing, to find some of the information that was missing we had to dig through the Usenet archives. Usenet could be thought of as a precursor to a modern internet forum. There's a lot more to it than that, but it's not super important, so just roll with it. And fortunately, most of it from that time has been archived and is now searchable through Google Groups. After a bit of digging around, we found that both Mike Biassi and Tim DePertuis were active there, particularly in the group Rec Games Miniatures. And going by things that Mike said there, yeah, Forge World USA did not get his permission to copy his models. I mean, since GW owned the rights to the designs, they technically didn't have to. So their copies were recasts of his work rather than being made from the masters, and as such suffered from the quality issues that you get with recasts, the Baneblade being apparently particularly rough. And Mike was pretty vocal about all this on those old Usenet posts, once saying,
"I just cannot stand Forgery World. They, as far as I'm concerned, stole the models they are producing."
Now, we're only getting one side of the story here. We couldn't find any comment from Forge World USA or Games Workshop about it, so we don't know how or if they reacted to this stuff. But it is understandable that Mike would feel frustrated seeing his work reproduced without his consent and to a poorer quality. However, in the end, Forge World USA did not last very long, only producing 40k models from around 1995 till 1996. Leaving the company that we mentioned right at the start of this video as the last company standing in the third-party companies making 40k vehicles game.
Armorcast was set up in 1995, taking over from where Mike Biasi Studios left off and acquiring the same license that Forge World USA did. They're also the second most annoying company in this episode to Google, what with us spelling armour the British way and then having to correct it every time. The first most annoying is Forge World USA for obvious reasons. Armorcast was run by Tim DePertwee and David Garton, with Mike Biasi sculpting the models for them, although not seemingly part of the company proper for reasons I'm sure made sense to them at the time. They went head-to-head with Forge World USA and won out when they became the sole third-party Resin 40k mini producer in 1996. This probably had a lot to do with the fact that, as well as producing new models, they were also producing new and improved versions of the old Biasi ones, with new masters created with sheet plastic, resin and modelling putty rather than clay, making for a cleaner finish to the final product.
This meant that there were improved versions of the Eldar Knight, Phantom Titan and Tempest, the Imperial Reaver and Warhound Titans, and the Baneblade and Shadow Sword. As for their new models, there were Eldar Revenant Titans and Falcons, that were a little different in size to the Epicast ones, Orc Battle Wagons and Great Gargants, Tyrannid Exocrines, Harrospexes and Malefactors, as well as cannons and blood cauldrons of Khorne. There was also a Superdetailed Baneblade, which is much like the other one, but better. The Tyrannid models they made, much like the one created by Forge World USA, are super interesting since their old epic incarnation is so different to their current models. Most are not even close to what they are now, although Armorcast were also in the process of creating a Trigon that is a little bit closer to its contemporary counterpart, but that one was never released. The Orc models are notable too, since the Battle Wagon is incredibly similar to the Orc Battle Wagon GW themselves put out in 1990, and the Great Gargant, as well as just being a huge monster of a thing, only ever had 313 copies made of it. So yeah, if you ever manage to get hold of one, then they're pretty rare.
Oh, and I suppose you're probably curious as to how much this stuff actually cost. Well, we have a full price list here from 1998. It ranges from the low end of $27 for the Battle Wagon, all the way up to a whopping $330 for the Great Gargant. It also lets us see that the precise difference between a regular and super detailed Baneblade is about $70.
On the 1st of October 1998, Armorcast's license to produce Resin Warhammer 40,000 miniatures was terminated and they were given 120 days to sell off their existing stock. It will probably not shock you to know that October 1998 was also the month that Forge World was announced. That is the GW subsidiary we know today and not the US one. Created in no small part due to the success of Games Workshop's own foray into absurdly large models, a fancy metal Thunderhawk that went on sale in 1997 for £400, which, adjusting for inflation, would be worth at least £400 in today's money. Forge World would grow far larger than any of those 90s companies, producing all manner of resin models for us to covet like the miniature hoarding goblins we are, including their own range of titans that are as impressive as they are expensive.
And that was it for these third-party 40k models.
But what about the companies themselves? We hear you cry like the warhorn of an Imperator Titan.
Well, Mike Biasi Studios and Forge World USA, as previously stated, stopped production during the 90s. Epicast would sell minis and terrain into the 2000s, including some of those not 40k but totally 40k models, going on to produce mostly scenic bases before ceasing trading sometime around 2014. Armorcast continued to produce minis, including doing a line of Battletech models, and are, in fact, still going, although they're not seemingly in the same hands. These days, they mostly produce terrain and bases, also a bunch of not actually Futurama minis for reasons known only to the Mesmo Frog. Actually, an interesting fact that is often brought up when discussing this topic is that all four of these US companies were based in California, and all around a 4-hour drive apart. Which I suppose is relatively close in the context of the United States, but we live in the middle of England. A 4-hour drive from here has a pretty high chance of us ending up in the sea, so it doesn't feel as special, but I suppose our experiences are not universal.
As for Mike Biasi, the man whose models were at the centre of this whole tale, well, he continued to create. Probably most famous for his frankly amazing Gramash cosplay from World of Warcraft, which won BlizzCon's cosplay contest in 2016. He sadly passed due to a stroke in 2018, but his legacy within Warhammer 40,000 continues, with his old sculpts still occasionally seen gracing tables to this day.
And since some of you may be wondering, why yes, we did go to Warhammer World to see if we could still use any of these models whilst playing there.
To which they said yes, provided you don't use them in tournament play because they're licensed by GW. And for the same reason, you could have an entire kill team made up of Bandai Chibis if you really wanted to. Although it should be noted that your local Warhammer store, much like ours, because yes, we asked there too, may disallow both because each store has its own specific rules to deal with that kind of thing.
Honestly, it's just nice whenever these videos give us an excuse to get out of the house, you know?
Oh, and before we finish, we'd like to put it out there that, well, you may have noticed there's a lot of dates or information that we were a bit vague on in this video, and that's because it took a lot of digging to uncover any concrete information beyond these models existed in the 90s and were made by these companies. Most of the extra bits we've mentioned were pieced together from many disparate sources, some of which contradicted each other, so hopefully we didn't make any major mistakes or omit anything too big, but if we did, and we probably did, that's our bad. But boy howdy was there somehow both a lot and no information to sift through on this one.
And to go back to what we said in the intro, looking back at all this, it's not surprising that people often refer to any model from these 4 companies as being from Armorcast. Their history is a little convoluted, and they were the last ones standing. Also, the fact that some of these models were made by 3 different companies at various times is going to lead to some confusion. I mean, we're not 100% sure that when we put up a picture of an Armorcast Titan that it's not actually a Might Beassi one, and whoever posted the original image got it mixed up themselves. In the end, calling them all Armorcast might not be right, but it is less of a headache, I suppose.
But now that we've made a video on the topic, whenever someone posts a picture of an old Reaver Titan and says, "This is an Armorcast Titan," you can respond with, actually, this could be a Mike Beassi Studios, Forge World, or Armorcast Titan.
Whereupon the other person will call you a gigantic nerd.
And rightfully so.